The reading for Module 5 starts off discussing the Renaissance. And of course, the word Renaissance means rebirth, and this is kind of a response to the bubonic plague that I talked about last time, where they saw so many people dying and their response became kind of artistic. And so the arts became very valued, and the artwork is very priceless today. If you see any Renaissance art, it's always very favored, at least to me. Maybe that's just me. I love Renaissance art. But the Renaissance actually happened in both the North and the South. In the North, it was more of an academic, educational Renaissance, and in the South, it dealt with the arts. And so one thing that happened in the North that I think is really important is the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg. And this contributed to people becoming literate, and the Bible, of course, was the first thing that was printed, and now people could read the Bible. Eventually they could read it in their own language, they could interpret it for themselves, and the church kind of lost some of its power and control over the people. Also, there were a lot of corruption that was happening within the church. And I think this was partly because of some of the ways that popes and bishops were being selected, and in part because of the Renaissance, because it kind of led to people living some really lavish lifestyles. And life was easier at the time too, so that obviously added to some of the corruption as well. So the real things that were problems in the churches dealt with the finances. They were taxing dioceses, and there were all sorts of building projects that were going up, and some of that was overextending the church. And of course, there was the selling of indulgences, which gained a lot of controversy. This was people paying money to a parish priest and expecting it to count for penance, and therefore saving them some time in purgatory, which is a Catholic belief, a kind of purification process we go through on our way to heaven. Also, there was a contribution that all the churches were expected to make called the Peter's Pence contribution, and all of this was supposed to go to the Vatican, but priests were taking some of the money and sending the rest on. And so that was obviously corrupt. Also, when they were dealing with who should be the bishop in different dioceses, this became really political. And with the role of bishop was added income. And so if you got to be the bishop, that meant you made more money. And if you could be the bishop of multiple dioceses, then you got, exponentially more money. And so that was a form of corruption. A lot of times when someone was named the bishop of a diocese, they may never visit that diocese. They may have never been there. And that was a problem too. Also, again, they led some really pretty lavish lifestyles, and some of the popes at the time that you'll read about led kind of double lives. Some of them had wives or concubines and had children and, lived a whole different life when they weren't in Rome. And then another problem dealt with nepotism, where if you were the pope, you might appoint your nephew to be the bishop somewhere. And nepotism happened in a lot of examples, but you'll read a lot about the Borgia family, where there was some wealth and also nepotism within the church from some of the family members who were popes and bishops. So this set the stage for what's known famously as the Reformation. And it started with Martin Luther, who had some concerns with the way that things were happening in the church, especially some of the corruption I already mentioned. And so he voiced his concerns in something he wrote called the 95 Theses. And just for the record, I think it was fairly common at the time to put your thoughts into writing and maybe even post them in a place where other priests could see. And that way you kind of invited them to debate your opinions. And so I don't think that part of it was that different. What was kind of different was that there was the printing press at this point in time, and so people could mass produce something like that. And usually something like that would be made public to other priests, but not necessarily lay people. And in this case, it was posted on the door of a church where lay people could see it. And it also kind of fanned the flames of a lot of, unrest and a lot of questions that people were asking about the power of the church. And so you'll read a lot about Martin Luther. I think two things are mostly important. His two kind of main teachings from this, which were called Sola Scriptura and Sola Fides. Sola Scriptura meant scripture alone, and he believed that there shouldn't be any teachings within the church that aren't rooted in the Bible. And also sola fides was faith alone, which he believed that it was our faith alone that saved us, and not our empty works, and not participating in all sorts of deeds that people thought earned their way to heaven. So you'll read a lot more about him, but basically a lot of people agreed with Luther and what he was saying, and this led to the Reformation. It's not fair to say or accurate to say that Luther set out to start the Lutheran Church. He really wanted to reform the Catholic Church. He was a Catholic priest. It's more accurate to say that the Lutheran Church was formed based on the teachings of Martin Luther and named after him, but he didn't, really start the church. There were some other reformers that you're going to read about. One of them is Ulrich Zwingli. Zwingli was in Switzerland, and he agreed with what Luther had to say about a lot of things, but took it a little step further. He was much stricter about church art and simplifying things and trying to get rid of anything extra. And he was very strict in his adherence in what he believed other people should do. He did not agree with celibacy. He wasn't very good at that himself. And so his reform movement was kind of the forerunner to the Amish. You'll also read about John Calvin, who's famous for his teachings on predestination. And that, of course, is that your fate, your eternal fate, is decided before you're even born by God, and nothing you do on earth determines that. He also believed in a theocracy, which is basically the church and state being one, and he also advocated for some very strict moral rules, and he wanted the church or the state to enforce those rules and treat breaking those rules or sinning as crimes. Another person you'll read about is Henry VIII. I have a real soft spot for Henry VIII because I'm somehow related to him. He had 6 wives, and there's a poem that helps you remember what happened to them. It's divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. And the one who survived, her name was Catherine Parr. My maiden name is Parr, so I'm related to Catherine Parr, and she outlived Henry VIII. And essentially, as you read about this, and I'm sure you've heard this before, but he wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, who he was married to for about 24 years. And he remarried someone named Anne Boleyn. He wanted to divorce Catherine because she did not bear him a male heir. And so the excuse he gave for divorcing her is that she was originally his brother's wife, but he was married to her for 24 years. And he wanted that marriage annulled. And the church denied his request, so he started his own church. And in England, there were a lot of religious leaders who started the Anglican Church, which in America is kind of the forerunner to the Episcopalian Church. And a lot of his cronies who worked with him and around him helped to kind of dissolve Catholicism in England and build up this new church. So you're going to read about them and his children and some of the queens that were his children as well that took over in the Tudor dynasty. And of course, Reformation happened in other places, so the chapter will cover some of the other smaller reform movements that happened. I also want to mention St. Ignatius of Loyola, who lived around this time. And of course, if you go to Creighton, you are familiar with St. Ignatius of Loyola. But he basically was injured in a battle. And while he was laid up for about a year, he was recovering, and he decided to read the lives of the saints. And this was a real conversion experience for him. So he dedicated his life to education and spirituality. And what he developed is famously known as the spiritual exercises, which has kind of the concept behind it of throughout our daily life, we go through moments of consolation and desolation. Moments of consolation are kind of the high points, and desolation kind of the low points. And that we grow spiritually from reflecting on those moments. Finally, we had the Council of Trent, which met, and the Council of Trent tried to address the complaints of the Reformation. Essentially, they invited the Reformed leaders to come so that they could all sit down and talk about it, hoping to work out these problems. But in the end, nobody showed other than Catholic leaders. And so when they met, they just reaffirmed most of their teachings. decided that they were right and the reformers were wrong about most things. One thing that did come out of it, though, was a solid number of the sacraments and the 7 sacraments that we recognize today. Finally, the chapter will end talking about some of the mission work where different countries have started to explore different lands that they can expand to, and how missionaries kind of followed the explorers and helped convert people to Christianity. Have a great day.